So, the world is in crisis. A mental health crisis, a meaning crisis. People everywhere are crying out and saying, how am I supposed to go on? How am I supposed to deal with this brokenness that I feel inside of me? There's anxiety, there's depression, there's PTSD, there is an emptiness of meaning in social environments. People are seeking meaning through all kinds of new ways that haven't been tried in many years in the Western world, through psychedelic drugs, through pagan religions, through other approaches to spirituality. And yet, we continue to see growth in this mental health crisis, this experience of man in the modern era. And so we turn to the self-help books of Amazon or chapters, and we say, somebody give me an answer. And we see things like badass ways to end anxiety and stop panic attacks, a counterintuitive approach to recover and regain control of your life, die-hard and science-based techniques to recover from anxiety and stop panic attacks. The purposeful planning method, how to plan your day, beat procrastination, and regain control of your time. The complex PTSD workbook, post-traumatic stress disorder book for trauma recovery and healing to regain control of your mind, body, and life. The 4-week endometrius diet plan, 75 healing recipes to relieve symptoms and regain control of your life. Anger management, a psychologist's guide to identifying and controlling anger. Master your emotions and regain control of your life. Well, this speaks to the problem. This speaks to the problem that is on everyone's mind. How can I regain control of my life? I feel like I am not in control of my life, and I want to have control. I feel like I am just this leaf in the wind that's being pushed about by strong emotions and behaviors that I can't even understand, that are crushing me and pushing me this way or that way. And what am I supposed to do about this problem? How am I supposed to regain control of my life? Well, perhaps I need to change my diet. I need to use the keto diet to regain control of my life. I need to exercise more to regain control of my life. I need to find some means of looking at this problem that will change my perspective so that I can regain control of my life. Well, perhaps the problem is that you can't actually control your life. And we're going to talk about that. So in my last video, we talked about PTSD and mental health, and we talked about particularly the effects of having your axioms or your first principles upon which you've built your whole worldview challenged by experiences. And this is Peterson's definition, really, of where PTSD comes from. It is when your worldview is blown apart by some experience that challenges your naivety in the world. And we talked about how mortality and awareness of mortality can do that. And we talked a bit about how recognizing the capacity inside ourselves to hurt others can do that to us. This would be what Peterson always kind of talks about as being the Auschwitz guard, that we all have to recognize that on some level we could do that and even desire to do that kind of a thing. It's inside of us, and until we come to terms with that, we can't really understand ourselves and grow meaningfully in our approach to the world's problems and our own worldview. Now, those are important, and I think if you want to see what I had to say about that, jump back and take a look, or perhaps you have seen it. But there is, I think, a far more prevalent cause for post-traumatic stress disorder and uh, and many other mental and moral injuries that men and women can face. And fundamentally, what it is that we are taught from the very earliest age that we can do anything. This is Western culture, right? That we can control our outcomes, that if we will hard enough and try hard enough, there is nothing that we cannot achieve. And we're constantly told when we are afflicted with hard circumstances that we need to take control of ourselves and we need to grow above that problem that we're facing and overcome it. And what happens when you face a circumstance that you can't overcome is that you are stuck in this situation where your whole worldview, if that's something that you've incorporated into yourself, is challenged by the reality of the environment that you're in. Now, of course, this happens all the time with soldiers in a combat environment. Uh, if anyone is given over to this idea of achieving the right outcome through dedication and sacrifice so that you can control winning or losing, it's definitely soldiers, right? I mean, drive the body, overcome pain, overcome adversity, and then you can build a team and shape this team into an effective fighting force, and you will defeat your adversary, right? But of course, that's not true. I mean, it is on one level true that that enhances your outcomes if you devote yourself to that. But what you can't control is when a bomb will go off or when a what the trajectory of an enemy's bullet will be, right? And so you literally cannot control whether or not you get shot. You can only minimize the opportunities that you present to somebody to do that. And what you really, really can't do is control the outcome for your friend, right? And so you're confronted with this feeling of helplessness. You know, I could describe in my own experience uh, on Easter Sunday, was it Easter Monday? Anyway, on Easter in 2007, um, I was in the middle of a place called Nalgam in what was then Zari district in Afghanistan in Kandahar province. And it was the seat of where the Taliban had originally come from when they rose up to defy the Mujahideen government and to overthrow the successors of the Soviet state and really create that regime. So it's a kind of a hotbed of insurgency in that time. And we had done a long range patrol into that area and were in the midst of a patrol base. So I was there with the armored vehicles as the battle captain or LAV captain, we call it at that time. And we had all the dismounted troops out and pushed out and doing individual patrols. And so I was, you know, basically providing the forward base with just the armored vehicles in a circle kind of thing, you know, round the wagons out and defend against anyone who might try and attack. And we were providing that logistics base to push stuff forward to the troops who were out patrolling. And it was at that time that uh, I remember when it came over the radio that hotel company, which had been my company before I transferred to India Company to go on that tour, and they were in a neighboring province out in what was called Maywand, and they had hit an IED, an improvised explosive device, and when it came over the radio and they started reporting the ZAP numbers or the kind of the numerical designation of individuals for casualty evacuation. And we did that so you wouldn't know when it came over the radio, you wouldn't assign that to a person in order to prevent kind of that mental and emotional upset. And and then they reported on each line for 6 numbers that they were VSA, means vital signs absent, right? So it just hit me, like that's my company. Those are my guys. Those are the guys I spent the last 3 years with, right? And 6 of them are dead. You know, well, um, I had no control there, right? And it turned out, as it came to pass, that that was my old platoon that I had commanded, and a number of those guys were guys that I had trained and prepared for this over 3 years as a platoon commander, and some of them were new guys that I hadn't worked with, but I gave them whatever I could when I was there to try and set them up for success. But in the end, a bomb blew up, and there's 6 men killed, dead, no longer with us, not on this mortal plane any longer. And I had no control over that, right? That's a confrontation. Now, based on my worldview, I was not traumatized by having my worldview torn apart by that, because I did not presume to have self control over their outcomes per se, you know. But but it's a realization, and it is a traumatic experience I can relate to enormously. That particularly if you have told yourself that you will not let anything bad happen, what do you do when the bad thing happens, right? So that's the kind of experience. But uh, you have to realize that you aren't in control, right? If you are telling yourself you control your outcomes, you're not being honest. It's functionally obvious that you aren't, right? There are so many things that you do not control. You might argue that you have no total control over anything in your life. You certainly should see this in a few very simple examples. Like, you cannot choose to not die, right? You may make choices which will make it less likely that you die tomorrow or next year, less likely, but you don't actually control whether it's going to happen, because there are things outside of your control which can make you die, right? Like the drunk driver on the road, or just some heart attack that you have no understanding is even building up, or an aneurysm in your brain, for crying out loud. And I remember one of the young fellas, when we were going through training, he's 19 years old, fit, soldier, infantry officer in training. Go to wake him up in the morning, or his roommate did, and found him cold dead. It had an aneurysm in his brain, died in the night, right? Not because he had done something wrong, not because he made poor choices that led to that outcome. That was just the way he had been put together in the womb. And so he had no control over that, right? You don't control your death. It's coming, right? Like, that's a reality. And we talked a bit about the need to incorporate that reality into our worldview last week. But that's something you have no control over, right? You can't choose to levitate. I mean, you can choose to, but it's not in your control to do so. So there's all kinds of impossible things that you don't control the outcome. If you try to choose something that isn't an outcome that is achievable, it isn't going to happen. Like, it's just not. So you aren't in control of all things, right? Now you say, oh, that's just being silly. Well, maybe. But you have to practically apply that to a much broader spectrum of things. Like, you can choose to be rich, right? Well, if you devote yourself to that choice in life, even coming from poverty in our world today, it is possible that you may achieve that outcome. But it's also entirely possible that you won't, because there's so many factors outside of your control that that may prevent that outcome from being a reality, even if you choose it, right? You decide I'm going to be rich. Well, that's fine, but if you have poor luck in the markets, I mean, call it luck, but there's things that may influence whether or not your investments prosper, right? You don't necessarily control those outcomes. You just choose to do your best. But if you make decisions that seem right, and then you have a financial collapse like occurred when the stock market collapsed during the start of the Great Depression, um, you're not going to achieve wealth if you haven't already built it up in things that last through those things, like real estate or whatever, right? So you might choose to be rich, but the opportunity may not come to you. You might choose to be rich and then become plagued with a chronic disease that requires all of your funds go into that, um, which leads to another point. Like, you don't actually choose not to be sick. Well, you might, but it doesn't matter because you don't control that. You are not in control of all of these outcomes. You didn't get cancer because you chose to. Now, you might make choices which increase your chances of getting cancer, but people who make all the supposedly right choices still get cancer, right? It's not within your control to not get cancer. It's not within your control to not just slip and break your neck. So there are a lot of things which are not in your control. You can choose to have a loved one, but that doesn't mean you get to control whether or not they will love you. You can choose to do the things that will win their affection and not actually achieve that outcome because they also have some control over the outcome of that decision you're making. And I think that's what happens, that Peterson talks about this when he says that even the breaking of relationships may actually create the conditions for PTSD. And that's something that some psychologists take grievance with because they say, well, that's not one of the approved criteria for PTSD. Well, yeah, whatever, man. Like, who cares what your approved criteria are? Are the symptoms the right symptoms? And was that the impetus for it? Is this an observed thing? Okay, well, so be it. It doesn't surprise me to hear that, because if PTSD is functionally what happens when you have created a worldview which does not incorporate the reality of the worlds, and then this worldview is challenged by events that are outside of your control that basically blow apart the foundations of your understanding of how the world works, uh, that's something that very much could blow apart your basic understanding of how the world works, particularly if you have a wrong view of how these things happen. You watch all these romance movies or novels, and you have this vision of how things are supposed to happen, and it doesn't happen that way. That could actually deeply traumatize you. It might sound weak and silly, but it's still true that even things like that, if they fundamentally confront your expectations and you have no way of incorporating that knowledge into the worldview you have, and you don't change that worldview, it creates this cognitive dissonance, which then may create a reoccurring traumatic experience with the consequences of that. So this is you want to talk about the broad expectation of where these kind of PTSD and mental health situations come from. Because someone might say, and indeed someone did say to me after that last one, well, yeah, but you talked about death and you talked about finding the evil inside of you, but that's all like soldier stuff. I don't think it is exclusively, but maybe the way I talked about it was, well, let's face it, like, this is where the confrontation with reality for everybody happens, when you think that you're in control of yourself and your outcomes, and your marriage falls apart, you have a divorce, that's like incompatible with your convictions and understanding of what's supposed to happen. You like I this isn't supposed to happen to me. How do I take control of this? You don't, right? Like you literally can't. This is someone else who has chosen, probably at least in part because of things you have already done, which, by the way, you can't change. So that's out of your control. It's in the past. But maybe not. Maybe it's entirely their choice simply to abandon you with no just cause. But you don't control it. And so you're confronted with that. And there's a conflict there. So, what do we do with that then? You might ask. Like, what do you do with that information? We know that we aren't really in control of all of our outcomes. Like, I can choose to be healthy. I may not turn out to be healthy. Like a lot of that has to do with genetic factors that are outside of my control. I can choose to be wealthy. I may not end up being wealthy because of many societal and economic factors that might be outside of my control. You know, like the kids in the dump in Haiti can choose to be wealthy and starve by the time he's 5. So you have a far better chance of realizing that than he does, but it's still not entirely in your control. It's in the control of your environment, your culture, and many outside factors. So if this is true, what do we do with the conflict between that reality and our conviction as a society that we need to be in control of things? It's interesting, you know, on this, in the same vein, when I was looking through my colleague and friend paper on PTSD, as I talked about before, he's American Lieutenant Colonel at Air College down in the States. And he was talking about the effects of American cultural expectations on recovery from PTSD. And one of the things he identified was that a huge problem, particularly in the American context, and particularly even more in the American military context, is that your value as an American is your productivity. You know, and this is something that has been very much inculcated into their perception of themselves, that my worth, my meaning is found in my success in life. Now, you get PTSD because of something, whatever it is, and it starts to impair your functionality because you're not sleeping properly, you're getting exhausted, anxiety is interrupting your effectiveness at work, and it creates a spiral because now not only are you suffering with those symptoms of PTSD, but your whole purpose and meaning is starting to be lost, because if my purpose is success and now I'm no longer successful, well, then I've lost all meaning and control. And this thing that is doing this to me, I can't control it. Like I want to control it and beat it, but I can't seem to do that. And so it's actually exacerbating the problem and creating a spiral into greater and greater and more dire circumstance uh, rather than healing. So, in order to foster healing, he posits you need to change that expectation in the member that is experiencing PTSD, and let them uh, kind of come to grips with the fact that they are not defined by their productivity. There's something of worth that they have to find that is outside of that, or else they're lost in a sense. Well, and that's it. So we talk about losing control and recognizing that you've lost control. And this is what I talk about when I say you need to have integrity in your personal structure, but that integrity has to be built to resist the real pressures that are really there in the real world. So if you're talking about your moral and ethical framework or your worldview, if one of your foundation stones here is that you've built the brick that as your cornerstone is that I will control my outcomes, you won't. And you might often feel like you are, and then eventually realize that you come up against something that you can't, and now your whole structure is built on this foundation stone that is not there anymore. Like it's destroyed. And so everything comes toppling down on top of that because you cannot escape the reality that you are not in control of all of your outcomes, and there's other things. Now, you might fall into being a victim and just start blaming other people, and you might, go into fatalism in a very negative way in response to that, and then just become a bitter and kind of purposeless human, which is certainly not what I would advocate, right? But you do have to recognize there's a problem with your integrity, and you need to find a place for this reality that you aren't in control and do something about that, because if you don't, you're just going to be stuck in this divided reality, this cognitive dissonance that is described, where I am trying to regain control, but I'm already aware that I don't have control all the time. So how can I regain control when there's things that I can't control? And you might start going to these self-help manuals like I talked about at the beginning, but ultimately, you might gain the illusion of control for a while, but you are going to confront again something that you can't control, like getting old, man. Like you're going to get old. You don't have the ability to stop that from happening. There's so many things in life you don't control. At best, you can mitigate the consequences, at best, and not always, right? So you need the humility to recognize a flaw in your worldview, and then you need to go somewhere with that and find a foundation stone that will hold up your house in the light of this new reality that you've understood. It's always been the reality, but you've just become aware of it. So what are you going to do about it, right? And the answer is you need to accept fatalism into your life. That might sound like a terrible thing to say, and it could be in the right context, but fatalism, just so you understand, fatalism does not mean to be fatal, like you're going to die, although perhaps, yes, that's part of it, but fatalism means to recognize fate, that there are things greater than you controlling the outcome, and that you're not actually in control of your outcome. That's what fatalism functionally is. And realistically, we all need to be fatalistic to some degree in order to function properly in this world where we are not in control of everything. Just a fact that we aren't, so we have to deal with that and somehow incorporate fatalism productively into our life. Now, Eastern cultures, Islam is very fatalistic. If you're not familiar with that, having spent quite a lot of time in Islamic cultures, it is the idea of inshallah is that if Allah wills, this will happen. It's applied so universally oftentimes based on the cultural understanding of that I can walk across this road, inshallah, I will live. Certainly, if you've ever tried driving around in Kuwait, a lot of inshallah going on there in regards to I can drive 160 kilometers an hour and pay no attention to traffic because it's in Allah's hands whether I die or not. I'm not sure that's a very productive way to approach the problem. I'm quite convinced it isn't. And they even will often say, inshallah, I'll be there tomorrow, like excluding themselves from any responsibility to try to be there on time. Well, yeah, that I accept that, idea that it's a very Christian idea, in fact, although it's not a very Western idea, unfortunately. You read James, he says, do not say that I will go here and do this or that and conduct business and make money for several months, for you do not know if you're going to die tomorrow, but rather you must say that if the Lord wills, I will go there and do this or that. Uh, he's not saying don't still make plans and try and do it. Just recognize that if you don't acknowledge that you don't have the ultimate authority over whether or not you succeed, then you're doing wrong. And I think that's what we have to do is we need to take that James approach, which is to say we need to have agency, we call it, and make decisions that are informed and wise as best we can to create the best possible outcome, whilst at the same time recognizing that the ultimate authority for our success doesn't reside within us, because there are greater things than us. There are even 7 billion other things like us which may try to prevent us from doing that, let alone other forces that are at work that may be uh, trying to, on one way or the other, affect the outcome of what you have decided you will do. So keep deciding to do things, but have enough fatalism not to leave it upon your own conscience if that should fail for reasons that are not the decisions that you've made, right? You cannot change the past. You cannot change the other forces that are at work. Therefore, you can only do what you can do, and you ought to strive heartily to do that as best you can. And then forgive yourself if it turns out that it's not going to happen for reasons that are outside of your control. This is necessary fatalism, right? And this becomes very difficult to do when you're talking about things in the past which were very traumatic and which really struck you, like those 6 colleagues, some of them who I had trained from bare recruits out of basic training that died for reasons I couldn't control. And part of you wants to grab a hold of that and say, this is your fault. We always do that, we want to be our own God and say that I can decide all of these outcomes, and that leaves us condemning ourselves when the outcome is bad. I get it, like I'm there, but nevertheless, you have to go back and intentionally submit that to the reality that you're not in control. And that's, I would argue, uh, it's achievable to some degree just by recognizing the reality. But how about this for you? You aren't in control. That's a fact. You have to accept it. Um, you may be a force that has some degree of influence on your outcomes, but you aren't in control of them. So if you can't take control of your life, what if all you can do is decide what does control your life? What if, instead of surrendering to apathy and despair because you have recognized that you are not in control of your life, you decide to surrender that control to something that is benevolent and good, that has a greater purpose for you, and you let it be in control of your life? This is freedom. This is the freedom that you need. Let's just put this in context for a second of mental health. So, mental health. So, we're talking about PTSD to some extent. Now, you may be experiencing PTSD. Maybe you're experiencing it because of something really tragic, like perhaps you were sexually assaulted, perhaps you are witness to a suicide of somebody you loved. I mean, there's some pretty dark and hard things that people face and confront, and I get that. And maybe it's as seemingly normal as just having had a relationship end and feeling completely at a loss because you can't you deeply 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 desire to restore that relationship, but it's out of your power to do so, and then you're stuck in that cognitive dissonance there, but whatever it is, you are needing to reframe your world, become less naive, as Peterson puts it, uh, so that you properly deal with the world as it is and not as you want it to be. That's great, right? And you need to do that. But it's not necessarily going to take away the damage that has already been done to you, right? Like, you can do whatever you want, and I do believe you can have real healing from these things. It's clinically in evidence for sure, and I could give many anecdotes of the efficaciousness of what I bring to you, which is faith. But that doesn't mean that you're not going to still have depression or anxiety or hypervigilance, because those things are not the same thing. We're talking here about the emotional, intellectual conflict that is ongoing, which increasingly adds to the damage. But there may be real ways in which your brain has become damaged from ongoing experience of stress, or your brain or your endocrine system, which is now impairing your ability to uh, control your emotional experience, or even just your intellectual perception experience. So that's possibly something that you can't make go away any more than if you drive your ATV down the trail at night and crash into a tree and smash your head open and do significant brain trauma to yourself that you can just choose not to be impaired by that. Like, these impairments may continue even if you get rid of the cause of the problem in the first place, which is that unresolved trauma. Well, you can't control that, but you can surrender to God through Christ and say, I can't control this, so I give control to you. And He might not take it away either, but He will give you meaning that surpasses this, and He will fill you with a purpose that allows you to rise above it. What if that's true? What if that's a real possibility for you, that even if you're injured, you can overcome the ongoing struggle, you can remove the cause of your injury, and you begin to heal to some degree. And even if you continue to suffer under your injuries, like, let me tell you guys, 20 years in the infantry, I just had shoulder surgery to try and repair damage that I did to my soldier like 17, 18 years ago. And like, I'm not 20 anymore, so that ain't getting better. It's just going to get less bad, perhaps, with the right treatment. She ain't going away. I don't control that this will be a fully healed shoulder. I've busted my back, broke both ankles 3 times. I've I've done lots of beaten up of this old frame, and and that's okay. Like, it literally is fine. It hurts, but yeah, yeah, I can live with that. I can carry on because, wow, like, so what? I have God in my life. I have purpose. I have something, a hope, which is that even if this thing's busted up, that's okay. I don't need it forever. Like, yeah, eventually it is going to die, and that's okay. I'm fine with that because I have something beyond this. And do I continue to experience the effects of stress in my life from some of my experiences? I actually do. Yeah, sure. I like pretty much every one of my colleagues that I've talked to about this, from having had those combat experiences, yeah, I do still have a hypervigilance thing. It's a weird thing. It's not rooted seemingly in anything beyond just this instinct. Maybe going 7 months on 4 hours sleep, and not letting yourself rest because you're afraid to miss anything, lest that cause somebody to die. Maybe that has a permanent effect on you. Seems to, and that's okay. So I don't sleep great all the time, and yet it really doesn't bug me. Like I I I have God, and I have surrendered to Him, and now I feel like I have freedom from the real sting of these things. You're all going to get hurt. We are all going to get hurt. We cannot control that. We are all going to suffer. But what are you going to do with that suffering? Are you going to let it destroy you? Because you can. Like, if you have any choice, it's this. You can let that destroy you. You can try to overcome it and take control of your life, but you cannot, and you will fail. You might be able to get some mental exercises to trick you into ignoring it and just carry on as if that wasn't happening. Maybe someone will say that's what I've done, and fair enough. Um, but I'm telling you that you can also acknowledge your lack of control and then give control to that higher power that is going to use that control. And I sincerely believe this, do all good things to those who love him. So that is what I challenge you with, and that is what I sincerely ask you to consider. Now, if anyone wants to try and reach out and get in touch or talk further about these things on a personal level, by all means, I'll put my Facebook link below, and you can personal message me and ask to have a chat about these things if that's something that interests you. Or if you want to have a conversation, or you even just have a request for something for me to talk about on these means, then by all means, fire away. And yeah, we'll see where this goes. If there's enough, if there's any interest, really, I suppose we'll keep at this, and it'll be better if you inform me what you think we ought to talk about. Cheers for now. Go in peace.